What is up, guys? So you might have noticed that I have not been reviewing Doom Patrol in a pretty long time. In fact, there have been 7 episodes and I've only reviewed 3, and there's no real reason for that. It's just that I stopped doing it for no real reason. I mean, I didn't really know what to say in those reviews because I don't know what's going on. It's very weird, this show, and I'm just along with the ride with you guys, so I didn't really know what to say, but also at the same time, I probably still should have reviewed it. So in this video, I'm going to review all 4 of the episodes that I did not review, which is episode 4 titled Cult Patrol, episode 5 titled Paw Patrol, those 2 episodes being a 2-parter, and then episode 6 titled Doom Patrol Patrol, and episode 7 titled Therapy Patrol, and then I'll review each one individually. I don't know how long this video will be, probably very, very long considering I'm reviewing 4 different episodes, but I will try to review each one as briefly as I can. So let's start with episode 4 titled Cult Patrol, the first part of this 2-parter episode, which is the big Decreator and Recreator episode. As weird as the show has been, this episode is probably the weirdest. Things like Nuremberg and the Book of the Unwritten and the whole cult and the Decreator, all of that was introduced in this episode, and as it turns out, all of that are actually things in the comics. It's like they found all the weirdest things they could find in the comics and brought it onto the show, and all stuffed it into this one episode as well, introducing all of these things, which is good, but at the same time, it's a little hard to follow with them introducing everything in this one episode. So I do think this episode is probably actually the worst episode of this show, which is saying a lot because this is a pretty good episode and the whole show in general is really, really good. But this episode introduced a character named Willoughby Kipling, who is basically just Constantine, and I mean that literally. He's literally supposed to be Constantine. The original creator of the character wanted to use John Constantine in the story, but DC or Vertigo didn't allow him to do that, so he created basically a carbon copy of Constantine called Willoughby Kipling, which is why he seems so similar on this show as well, and I think he's pretty good as well. He leads the charge of these 2 episodes of Cult Patrol and Paw Patrol fairly well. We don't see him at all after that for the 2 episodes that have been released, but I'm hoping we do see him more in the show because he is a pretty good character, and I'm guessing whenever they have these magical things like these the cults, he's probably going to return. A lot of this episode has to do with that cult I've been talking about, the cult of the Unwritten Book, which the Unwritten Book is this kid who grew up thinking that he would save the world, but in the end he was lied to. Instead, he's going to destroy it via the Decreator, and they need to use him, which he is the Unwritten Book, to summon the Decreator, which they do actually do that in the end, and I like that they did that. It's a very great ending to this episode, making this episode and the next episode a 2-parter, which I do think was a good idea. And this episode had a lot of scenes where especially Rita Farr bonded with this guy, and in the end he just disappeared. I'm pretty sure that was in the beginning of the next episode, but still, I mean, these scenes were pretty compelling for the most part. These scenes added a lot of layers to Elastigirl or Rita Farr as a character as well, and in general they were pretty good scenes. This episode had some pretty great fight scenes as well, really just one of them, which is Cyborg and Willoughby Kipling, as well as Negative Man versus all these papermen. This was a pretty great fight scene where Cyborg would use his cannon blaster and Willoughby Kipling using his fire sword. I mean, it looked really, really good. You also have Negative Man for like one small shot using the spirit in his body to take out some papermen. This was in general a pretty great fight scene in this episode. It even had a shot of Elastigirl using her powers for the first time ever since basically the entirety of the show. So even after this episode, she doesn't really have superpowers. It's really just a disease or a sickness that she has, which is that she can't put her body together. But in this one shot where she punched somebody using her elastic powers was the only time on the show so far that she used her superpowers, and that was a pretty great moment as well. In conclusion, I think this episode is a lot more flawed than the rest of the season. It's really the first episode of the season that I think has a couple of major problems. The big one is really the main one, is that it just introduced too many very obscure comic book concepts and characters in one episode. They really stuffed all of it into one episode to the point where it was a little bit hard to follow, where they didn't really explain a lot of it very, very well. That's the big problem. There are a lot of great things about this show, or this episode, I mean, with like the fight scenes. Willoughby Kipling was a great characters, a lot of other great moments. The ending also with the Decreator showing up was also a pretty good ending to the episode, but this episode is probably my least favorite episode of the season so far, which is saying a lot because I will still give it a very high score of 9 out of 10. Then there's the second part of this two-parter episode, which is episode 5, titled Paw Patrol, which a lot of it saw Crazy Jane's backstory in the psychiatric ward, this kind of abusive psychiatric ward as well, which is a great expansion on the character and her backstory. We also saw how she joined the Doom Patrol. With the scenes were actually not really in order, where you see her joining the Doom Patrol, and in the end you also see the chief rescuing her from the psychiatric ward, which will lead into the scene earlier where she joins the Doom Patrol, or at least she joins Doom Manor. And I think they did a good job at showing us her origin story, with also at the same time just trying to stop the Creator in this episode, where Mr. Nobody and the Chief come up with this plan. Mainly the Chief come up with this plan using Mr. Nobody's powers to go back in time and use the Dr. Harrison, which is one of the Crazy Jane personalities, and use her to create this other cult that would create the Recreator, which I guess these Decreator and Recreators are just based off faith and nothing else. They only exist if people believe in them, which and they're all created by people's beliefs, because I guess they're not actually real. I don't know how that works. It's a little bit confusing, but this plan was very, very, very different from anything we ever seen, especially like time travel. Definitely a very original use of the concept of time travel. It's not really time travel, it's really just Mr. Nobody and his voice going back in time, which it seems like it's really no problem for him at all. I guess that's one of his powers, or he's using the concept of there not being a fourth wall for him because he broke it, where they could just go to another scene and he's there as well. I don't know which one it is, but it's definitely a very original use of, if it is time travel, then time travel. But I think this episode did a good job at executing that storyline as well, and also kind of did a better job than the last episode at explaining and just fleshing out all of the concepts and characters they introduced in this two-parter episode, or at least after this episode there was a lot more time to have all these concepts and all these characters be fully introduced. In this episode, the Chief returns to Doom Manor, and he could walk now because Mr. Nobody let him walk, just so they can stop the Decreator, because the Decreator is a threat to Mr. Nobody as well. And I actually really like that dynamic of the Chief and Mr. Nobody working together to take out a common enemy. That was definitely pretty awesome, and it's really only 5 episodes into the show, and we're already seeing something like that. I really like the back and forth between the Chief and Mr. Nobody as well, and also all of the reunions and all of the character moments with the Chief and the rest of the yet unnamed Doom Patrol was definitely a lot of great moments. In the end, there was a moment with Dr. Harrison, or Crazy Jane, with the Chief, and that was going to be a great moment, but interrupted by Mr. Nobody showing up and trying to take the Chief back. I think this was a great moment in the episode, where there's just such a good looking shot where Cyborg has his sonic cannon out and Mr. Nobody shows up behind him. The CGI in the shot, the colors of the shot, it just looks so good. Probably the best looking shot of the show, and also it's a very intense moment as well, leading up to Cyborg and his sonic cannon just blowing up, and he lost a part of his arm, which Mr. Nobody obviously did, and the Chief is gone. Another great not really ending, but conclusion and climax to this episode, and just such an intense moment as well. But in conclusion, I think this episode was a great conclusion to this two-parter with the cult and the Decreator, and now the Recreator. It had a great origin story and flashbacks for Crazy Jane, and also there's the concept of time travel being used in this episode was done so originally and so greatly, and the Chief returning for this episode. Also, Mr. Nobody wasn't actually in the last episode, which was also a big draw out for that episode, which is the fact that he wasn't in it at all. Definitely easily the best character, most interesting character on the show, which is why this episode is definitely a lot better, or at least one of the reasons. And also the moment at the end with Cyborg and Mr. Nobody was just such a great moment, so I will give this episode a 9.3 out of 10. Next is episode 6, very aptly titled Doom Patrol, which is such a good title for an episode, especially an episode like this one. The episode begins with these flashbacks with Rita. Rita is definitely the main character of this episode because of her connection to Mento, a character that I thought would have a much bigger role on the show, but it turns out he's like a 90-year-old man, and he probably won't appear at all after this episode, and if he does, it's probably not going to be anything more than a cameo, because in the comics, Mento and Elastigirl are married, or they do have a lot of romance, and they are married sometimes. This episode does definitely address that romance, but it turns out that that was really in like the 60s or 70s, and now he's way older than she is. Not older, just he aged. Well, she didn't, but this episode introduced the old Doom Patrol from the 1950s, consisting of Mento, Lodestone, and Celsius. And I think this was a great way to use these characters, and this was just a great decision for the show to introduce this original Doom Patrol, which is not really a thing from the comics. The comics doesn't have two different Doom Patrols that exist 60 years apart from each other. There's only really one, and all of these characters exist on that Doom Patrol at some times, but this episode and this show did something different, using two different Doom Patrols. But basically the entirety of this episode is an illusion. There's really only two moments that matter in this episode that is worthy of talking about, which is one, Crazy Jane learning that Chief abandoned the original Doom Patrol, which makes her think a little bit differently about the Chief, and also there's a reference to the Brain, who will probably be the main villain of the second season of this show. The Brain is easily the most famous Doom Patrol villain, at least he was before this show came out, and Mr. Nobody was made more famous than he was before, but the Brain has been a villain of the Teen Titans TV show in the last season, and I think that he can definitely be a great villain for the second season of the show, and he probably will be. But then it's all revealed that everything that happened on this episode, all like Mento and not really aging, and Lodestone and Celsius not aging either, and there being this metahuman school for all of these kids, it's all revealed to be an illusion created by Mento's mind. Which was a pretty great reveal and kind of a twist on this episode that I definitely did like quite a lot. I honestly expected after this episode for like Mento to be a member of the team and like join the Doom Patrol and be a recurrent character and love interest for Rita Farr, and maybe even Celsius and Lodestone joining the team as well, or just being recurring characters. But this episode had a twist where it turns out they're all really old. They all aged normally, where they were like in their 20s and the 50s. Now they are like 90 years old, and that makes a lot of sense. So this is a great twist that I did like quite a lot. There was another storyline in this episode with Cliff and Vic, and it was very much focused on their father issues, with Cliff having issues about being a father, and Vic's issues with his father, and this was definitely a great character development for the characters. Like I said, basically every single episode has these layers added to these characters, and does such a great job at that as well. Cliff struggling with the fact that he wants to see his daughter again. He learned that his daughter was alive a couple episodes ago, and now he wants to see her, and Vic isn't really letting him or like access her social media. In the end, he does, because Cliff helps Vic with his father issues of not really trusting his father, not really wanting his father to parent him so much as he is right now, and that's all resolved at the end of this episode. It's not exactly the best storyline of the show yet, but it is definitely a great storyline that adds layers to these characters and leads very well into the next episode, which deals with Cliff's daughter and the fact that he learned that she has this new dad, and also Vic's father issues and the fact that his father got rid of the safety on Vic on Cyborg, leading pretty well into the next episode. In conclusion, this episode had a lot of great moments, but what really made it was the twist near the end, that everything that was happening in that area, in that school, was all an illusion. There was also the other storylines with Cliff and Vic that were pretty great, some great references like the Brain. In the end, this episode is another great episode for the show, with a very clever title as well, so I will give it a 9.4 out of 10. Then there's episode 7, titled Therapy Patrol, the episode that came out right before I'm making this video, and probably right before I am uploading it as well. So basically, I am now caught up after reviewing this episode, but this episode showed each member of the Doom Patrol as a kid, and then also showed their morning struggles, all leading into the one joint storyline where they all have therapy. It showed Rita, Larry, Vic, Jane, and also Admirable Whiskers, a new character that was introduced in this episode. We probably won't see him again in this show, but I will also talk about him as well. And I'll go over every single one of these storylines individually, but let it be known that this is definitely my favorite episode of the season so far. First of all, each one of these storylines, each one of these segments for each of one of these characters showed each one of the members as a kid. It showed Rita as a kid meeting her superstar idol and showing that her parents wanted her to become an actress and were planning on her becoming an actress for the entirety of her life, showing that she probably lived a very spoiled, privileged, and diva lifestyle, and that fits the character very well from what we know, and that led into the morning struggles that she had very nicely. Then there's Larry, where his parents are arguing about the fact that he is gay, and learning that the fact fact that he is gay, which again also definitely led into his morning struggles very nicely as well. And then Vic, where he's at the doctor and it's very clear that he's scared of his dad and he is not scared of his mom, and that led into the morning struggles as well. Not as nicely, but it led into the therapy for him very, very well as well, with having to do with his mother and his father. Then Jane was the only one that I didn't really get, which was that she was crying in her crib, and then her father walked over and didn't do anything about it, which it might be addressed in the future, but it was not addressed in this episode, so that was the only one that I didn't really get in this episode. But then there is Cliff, showing him as a kid and showing that he had his parents were not in a very good relationship and that his father was abusive to her as well, which also led into the therapy of Cliff in this episode very, very well. All of these scenes as kids were a great start to all of these storylines, leading into what would become their therapy and their morning struggles of this episode. But speaking of those morning struggles that we saw in this episode, as well as the therapy we see later, is incredible character development for these characters. We see what we've seen before, which is that Rita wakes up and she doesn't have her body together and she's trying to do that, but we also see her fall into a furnace and try to get out of that. All of that is things that we kind of have seen before for the character. Really, for the most part, the character development that we get is that she thinks she deserves this because of probably what we saw in the second episode, which is that she did something to a baby, probably something irredeemable that they might address in this storyline or in this season, where every single time she looks up she sees some baby imagery and that reminds her of what she did. And I just think this episode does such a great job with the character development of this character specifically, and the actress also does a great job in the role as well. Then there is a Larry storyline, which is mostly his struggles with being gay, which I would have much preferred to see his struggles with the fact that he is burnt alive and he's completely disfigured and he has to wear these bandages. That would have been a little bit more interesting, but this storyline does a good job at the character development for the character, and also the character development between Larry and the Spirit and their connection, and I do really like that dynamic a lot on this show. I think they're doing a great job with that dynamic between Larry and the Spirit, and this episode definitely does continue that. But then there's also Victor Stone and his morning struggles of trying to get a date. Now that his safety from his dad is off, he now has, I guess, he gets alerts from his social medias and also this dating profile that he has, and he has a lot of struggles trying to get a date on this app. And it's a more great character development for Cyborg as well. He even said his catchphrase "booyah," and I think that was a great moment where he asked Grid if he says "booyah" a lot, and then Grid said, "You said it 31 times since the accident," which is above the threshold for a catchphrase, which was a great moment in the storyline. Just like the rest, is great character development for Cyborg. And then there is Jane, and what I like about this is that it showed conflict between two of her different personalities, one of them being Jane and the other one being Hammerhead, and I'm pretty sure those are the only two that showed up, but we've never seen anything like this before, like conflict between the two personalities. I know I've said this word a lot, but it's also great character development for Crazy Jane and her other personalities in the conflict between it. There's not really much else to add about this storyline. That's really all there is. But then there's also Cliff, which was a storyline that I didn't really understand what was happening until the end, when it was revealed that there was a rat in him. But he was seeing some crazy stuff where he was very angry about the fact that his daughter had this new parent, or had this new father, that she was adopted by somebody else, and this made him go insane, or so I thought. It turns out that the rat made him go insane, but he had a lot of different things that he was seeing, where he went to this guy's house, got insanely angry at him, and it turns out that that guy was actually Cyborg in real life, and he didn't actually drive out anywhere, which while that was happening, and while we saw that earlier, I just think they did such a great job at executing this episode, where we see like the different perspectives of the morning and how that led into Cliff's storyline, especially where what's happening where he drives out of the city. It doesn't really make any sense. It doesn't really correlate with the other storylines, but then it connects where it turns out he's not really seeing things correctly, and I do think that that was a great conclusion to that storyline as well, and that's just such a great storyline. Just say again, great character development for Cliff. But then after all of the storylines conclude and come together and we see all the perspectives of the morning of Doom Manor in that day, Cliff gets the idea to talk to each other and have this therapy, which is such a great scene altogether. More great character development, not only for the characters individually, but also all the characters together as a team. The standouts are probably Rita and Negative Man, where they show or they tell their struggles and they expand on what we saw in the morning, where Rita is also her struggles with the fact that she can't put her body together, but also what she did and what Mr. Nobody is tormenting her with. And also there's Larry with the fact that he was gay and now he made a mistake that led to him becoming Negative Man. And then also Vic thinking that he was responsible for the death of his mother. All of it come together for a great scene and a great character development for all of these characters individually, but also as a team. And in the end, they all see the painting that one of the personalities of Crazy Jane painted back in, I think, episode 2. This painting probably foreshadowing what will happen maybe in the season finale of this season, and I cannot wait to see that. And just as I thought, this episode was almost perfect, but needed a little bit more Mr. Nobody, or any Mr. Nobody at all. He finally appeared at the end of the episode as a narrator talking to this rat and convincing him that he needs to do something to Robot Man, the guy who I guess was the driver of the truck or the bus that ran over his mother. And it's pretty insane what's going on here. It doesn't really make any sense how this rat is so intelligent and how Mr. Nobody can talk to him. I have no idea. It doesn't really make any sense. A lot of this show doesn't really make any sense and is very weird, but at the same time it's such a great ending to this episode and such a great ending to the storylines, which all came together in the end in such a satisfying and great ways that in the end I think this episode is easily the best episode of the show so far, and I will give it a 10 out of 10. But anyway, if you made it this far into the video, let me know all your thoughts about all 4 of these episodes in the comments down below. And also, I put up 4 different polls in the top right corner of the video where you can vote on what you thought about this episode this time around for all 4 of these episodes. But anyway, let me know all your thoughts, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.